Okay, welcome back to another VFX time-lapse. This time we're looking at some of the car shots from the music video. So most of After Effects is built for kind of 2D effects, but there's a lot of plugins and things that you can kind of simulate 3D engines or use 3D models in your shots. I don't work a lot in 3D usually. I'm not a 3D modeler. I haven't used a lot of 3D software, but some of the tools that are available give me some shortcuts and allow me to kind of work quickly. So here you see me kind of playing with the design of the shot from the trailer. This was the first time we were kind of locking in the specific assets and color schemes and things that we were going to be using for the rest of this sort of abstract retro world that we were going to be seeing. My original plan was actually to isolate the car completely from the footage and kind of create the road from scratch and the environment. But anytime I used a, fake, ground plane road, it just didn't look as good as, that raw texture from the actual street. So I ended up actually keeping that in as part of the shot, just tinting it a dark, purple to kind of match the vibe. Okay, in this next shot, this was the interior of the Delorean that we were filming with. So using some examples from like other 80s future cars, I kind of built my own interface in Photoshop and then was able to insert that into the dashboard. So this shot actually wasn't originally part of the script. We were actually filming other parts of the car and then thought, hey, it'd be neat if she has some kind of interaction with the car that creates like a speed boost. And so we're like, all right, we'll shoot, what is essentially just the air conditioning controls, and she's turning a dial. And essentially the only thing that remains in the final shot is that dial. VFX usually looks better if there's some kind of physical element, especially if an actor is going to be interacting with a CG element. So I left the dial in place, but then replaced everything around it. I thought about replacing the tape deck, but again, with these shots like this, you got to work quickly, and I actually kind of liked, again, leaving some of the physical elements in so it didn't flatten out the interface too much, and it kind of gives it that little sense of realism. Like, oh yeah, this could be part of a car, but there's just enough kind of different about it. And here you can see me doing the final tweaks to the color and adding glow and kind of making that layer more integrated into the shot. You'll see later on, we actually color corrected that shot too, to match this shot. So we kind of got this, not sure if we were actually going to use it or not. In the script, there wasn't really plans to show Melody inside the car in profile driving with, the background moving behind her. We thought that might be a little outside the scope of, what we were trying to do, but we're like, hey, let's give it a shot. So we, instead of using a green screen, we actually just put up a white reflector that we had and kind of used that as a green screen. And it's not as good as a green screen, I'll tell you that, but it definitely gets you about 80% of the way there. Because basically it functions like a green screen in that you can kind of, as long as there's contrast between the background and what you're trying to cut out, that's all you really need to get a good mask. So I can use something called a Luma matte, which kind of helps me knock out that window and put whatever I want back there. So this shot, I'm happy with how it turned out. It was definitely a challenging shot. Getting a 3D camera tracker to kind of stay locked on the footage when you have a foreground object like the car getting bigger and bigger in frame. Essentially, the less background detail I have, the harder it is for these 3D camera trackers to, lock on to detail. So it did a pretty good job with about half of the shot, and then the second half I had to kind of manually simulate the panning motion because the the automated thing was just not doing that for me. But once you have that 3D data, it's actually pretty straightforward to throw your 3D elements in space. You have to push them, really far back in Z space, as they call it. And I was playing with, reusing some of the city elements you've seen in other parts of the video. And then, of course, going through and kind of, again, I'm not really a 3D wizard by any means, so I had a very hacky kind of way of getting this 3D model in there, and then almost painting, the windows in by hand, rather than trying to create a, 3D texture that gets wrapped around a model. I'm sure there's tons of other VFX artists that could tell me how to do this better, but hey, you do what you can. So here I'm actually rendering out the background as footage. Again, there's a lot of, when you're working with 3D and you have a lot of models and textures rendering, every change you make, you have to wait for the program to kind of catch up to you. So the more you can kind of flatten out and you render it once, you're like, okay, this is just one layer now. That whole background is just one layer. And that lets me work much faster on like doing things like color correction and being able to compare that with the background. There's all sorts of little tricks like that can kind of speed up the process. And then here you can see me kind of doing the reflections. So the reflections in this shot were actually, I mentioned earlier how I rendered out the background as a piece of footage. Well, I took that flat footage and distorted it and tracked it into place so that essentially each window of the car just has a piece of footage playing over it. But it's distorted in a way that matches the shape of the window, and it gives you the impression of the car reflecting the environment. And moving on to the next shot, this is the license plate opening shot. So, we wanted to put the title of the song on the license plate, but it's a pretty, there's a lot of letters in that word, unattainable. So we did the classic, license plate version of that word, shrunk down about as much as we can, with it still being readable. This is another example of a shot that to do motion tracking for the background is always tricky because it's completely out of focus. So you have to kind of just track these blobs of color. Sometimes the automated things work. For this one, I actually ended up just kind of manually setting those motion keyframes, specifically for that little pan that the camera does up into the sky. And again, just kind of reusing elements that we've already seen. Okay, this is another interior car shot. It's another similar shot, but she's in a totally new environment and there's different action going on. So at this point, the idea would be that she's actually driving a lot faster, and that kind of creates this like wash of colored lights kind of flying by the car. I actually started this shot just approaching it in a very kind of two-dimensional way. Like, okay, I'll create a layer and I'll have colors animating really quickly across, and it'll just be like almost like a warp tunnel. But instead I thought I'd play with, again, incorporating some 3D models. So I actually took a model of a city. So right there you could see me doing my first test with one of the cities, but I decided, this model's too short. I found another model that actually had a lot more space to it, because again, she's driving really fast. And for me to simulate that motion across time, I wanted to actually have buildings kind of stretching the full length of, that she would actually be driving. So I set up multiples of this little city model, and then I drew up a texture in Photoshop with lots of colored windows and things, and basically did a projection of that texture over all the buildings. So what I ended up with was, again, a huge wash of color, but that color is kind of mapped onto objects into Z space. So as the camera's panning by, you can kind of see lots of movement at different levels. And then you can also see that with her highlights in this shot, I also kind of animated some colored hues that are rolling by to simulate the light outside, hitting the car and hitting her. All right, here we are at the final shot. This was a real doozy, because it's actually 2 VFX shots combined into one, but I'm only going to cover the first part of it here. So this is another drone shot that we had basically a full take of a drone following the Delorean, but it had some kind of juddery movements. So the plan was to kind of just use a chunk of it, just find a good space. But for the motion that I had in mind for the car, I ended up finding a way to actually use the full take by sort of smoothing out those irregular drone motions, just kind of through cropping and animating the position. It's all sort of difficult to explain with words, but you can kind of see the process at one point here. So for this shot, she's kind of out of the mountains, out of the city. She's almost like elevated to this celestial plane, really abstract and very like epic feeling. So I was playing around with different ideas to kind of capture that, stellar look. And I really like the look of these kind of dotted graphics. It just felt very like retro, but also almost, like heavenly. So I created this tunnel and really just sort of winging it, just throwing ideas out there and like, oh yeah, this looks cool, and pushing it and tweaking that. This tunnel, maybe something should grow from the center of it, and we'll do some kind of portal thing, like we've been referencing portals kind of through the whole music video. So now the car is approaching a portal of sorts. So this is all sort of my rough first pass at this shot. There was a lot that was unfinished. I hadn't even gone through the process of masking out the car or anything. You can see the road and the car are like totally blown out. That is something that I go back and adjust later. The idea was going to be that as soon as the car vanishes, this screen kind of shuts off, and we wanted to end the video on a game over. And in the first draft of this shot, which I'm still working on here, the car just sort of drives at a steady rate and kind of disappears into this light. But there wasn't really there was something lacking there. Like it just felt like we needed to have a little bit more motion. Sort of like a speed boost kind of into the horizon kind of effect. So that's when I come back and do my second pass of the shot, you'll kind of see me implementing that. And here's me having to paint out all these logos and things and insert my own logo. So if you want an interesting story about an urban legend, definitely go look up Polybius. There were tons of things to adjust with this shot, tons to erase and logos to replace and things like that. One of the challenging things, though, was actually getting the lights to match. So that melodious title that we replaced up there, had to be able to react to the color of, the arcade cabinet. It has these LED lights that are constantly changing color. So I had to animate the hue of any kind of fake layer that I introduced needed to, match that motion. That also goes for the back wall. And now I'm erasing the side cabinets and just kind of making up some random fake video game names to throw on there. And then sort of the final icing was adding a little bit of like a portal, residual portal, I guess, kind of showing that this portal that had opened up is now closing. So I used a similar effect. Again, this Saber plugin from Video Copilot makes a great kind of it's actually a plugin people use to make lightsabers, but it makes a great portal too. So that's kind of what's making up the outline of that cabinet screen. So I mentioned at the start of this shot that I had to smooth out the drone motions, and I didn't really do that until the second pass. So that's kind of what we're watching here. You're also seeing me try to eliminate the shadow of the car because I needed to keep the road texture clean, and I'm animating the car beyond where it actually drove on the road. So, you'll notice the shadow of the car kind of disappears as soon as the fake movement of its acceleration starts to pick up. And of course, what would a DeLorean be without a nice little flame track behind it?